Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. This week, the commander we're discussing is nothing short of a Myrkul. Myrkul, Lord of Bones, took Baldur's Gate by storm. A 7-mana god, it becomes indestructible if we're below half-life, and every time one of our non-token creatures die, we can exile that card to create an enchantment version to replace it. It's not often we see a 7-mana commander earn such a high degree of popularity. The overwhelming majority of the top commanders in the format tend to be around 4 mana, but Myrkul is the third most popular commander from the Baldur's Gate set, and the second most popular Obzon commander overall, possibly creeping up to take the top spot soon. Myrkul's page reveals a great mix of great cards, but to be honest, I think we'll understand it best by getting a fuller picture. So let's grab Myrkul's average deck list from the average deck feature and import it to the Architect deck building website. As always in this series, any swaps we make must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. Dang, that's a lot of creatures. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that's a lot of potential enchantments. When Myrkul was first revealed, I remember seeing a lot of players hyped about an Obzon Enchantress commander, but based on this average list, I'm not confident that Enchantress is the right word for us to use. I honestly love decks like that though. This is a very contradictory type of deck, even though it doesn't contradict itself at all. It has a lot of enchantment synergies, but only 9 enchantments, and many of the Enchantress staples wouldn't suit this strategy. This isn't just true for enchantments either. This is also a token deck, and an aristocrats deck, and also kind of a control deck. And it's many other things too, but instead of being any of those things directly, it navigates those strategies by being, first and foremost, a deck that is chock full of creatures. Let's get our bearings by examining Myrkul's core cards first. As mentioned, the enchantment synergies are some of the primary standouts, especially stuff like Doomwake Giant and Citizen Champion. While this deck doesn't care about casting enchantments the way that most Enchantress decks do, it does care a lot about constellation triggers, and having a high number of enchantments in play in general. Every little creature we lose, whether it's a sacrifice outlet, a mana dork, or a token maker, will come back as an enchantment and stick around for a long time, because enchantments tend to be much harder for enemies to deal with than any other card type. This is where the token synergies come in too. These enchantments are tokens, which means we can double them or use a card like Jaheira to make them tap for mana, or copy their effects with Weaver of Harmony. But here's the real synergy that people clocked immediately with Myrkul: Devoted Druid and Friends. These creatures can place -1 counters on themselves to untap, allowing their abilities to be used multiple times a turn. When they die and become enchantments, they still have those abilities, but they no longer have a power and toughness because they're not creatures anymore. So we can tap the Devoted Druid enchantment token for mana, then untap it by putting a meaningless -1 counter on it, and repeat. Or we can make our enemies lose their whole hands with Cinder Haze, or prevent all damage dealt to us forever with Barrington Medic. Yeah, this deck is doing some nasty strong stuff. Heck, now imagine if we turn Elish Norn, Platinum Angel, or Beladros into enchantments. Make these awesome table-turning effects into something nearly impossible to deal with, so not only are they hard to kill, but so are we. And once we've set up our fortress, an influx of tokens will serve us extremely well, especially as we make more and more enchantments over time, proccing even more constellation effects to give us more bodies and inexorably move our way to victory. Alongside a huge suite of aristocrats, our opponents will suffer death by 1,000 enchanting cuts. Alright, with that understood, let's get to business. We'll have 2 parts to this video. First, our normal upgrades, and a second section to help make this deck more budget-friendly. Let's kick it off with part 1. Alright, actually, for this first part 1, I have like almost 0 notes. Like, have you seen this deck list? This average deck list is so sick. It's dang near perfect already. And I'm not gonna just make swaps for the sake of making swaps, you know? I'm gonna end up making like 1 change that I think will improve things. But for the most part, this deck is just excellent. So yeah, the majority of this video will be the budget part. Seriously, looking through all of this, what would you have reason to cut? Nothing strikes me as out of place or odd or not pulling its weight. The list even fills in all of the gaps that we sometimes see in this series. You know, for instance, if a deck is playing like a Cultivate but not playing the Kodama's Reach, that's a gap. Or if a deck is playing Llanowar Elves and Elvish Mystic but it doesn't have a Fintorn Elf, that kind of thing. This deck doesn't really have that problem. There's nothing that I feel the need to fuss over. I'm just sitting here in admiration, like, what an excellent pile of cards. I suppose I could make the case that if we're playing Beast Within, we probably could also play Generous Gift, but I'm not so worried about that I feel the need to cut something just to make room for one more piece of removal in here. Even the land count, only 34 lands, doesn't actually bother me for this deck. Normally it would. I mean, Myrkul is 7 mana, but we have more than 20 ramp effects in this deck. 20! Even when our mana dorks die, they become enchantments that produce mana for us. We are set. I mean, I guess if I'm gonna get really nitpicky, technically we're playing Sandstep Citadel, and we could swap that for Path of Ancestry instead, which would serve the same basic function, except that it lets us scry whenever we cast our commander. Or we could play both of them. I could swap out a basic. I'm not sure. I mean, I like this deck's tempo. So maybe this is a straight across swap, sure. But like, that's the level of granularity that I feel we're at with this deck. I'm asking whether or not a single random land might give us 1 or 2 more scries than another random land that comes into play tapped. There's just not so much that I feel the need to fix. This deck is a work of art. The only card that I will actually give a little bit of critique to is the Kaya. I like her. I think she's cool because she can double up the tokens that our commander will make, but I just found that her timing is a little clumsy compared to our other options. So what I'd love to do is swap her out in exchange for another endgame token maker like a Tendershoot Dryad, but that is currently a pricey card. So what I'll do instead is go with another more tricksy one that I think Myrkul will just love, and that's the card Thieving Amalgam. It makes bodies for us by stealing and manifesting cards from other players' decks, and it punishes our opponents whenever those creatures die, fitting right in with our nickel and dime win conditions. But here's the part I really like. When the manifested creatures die, as long as they were a permanent card, Myrkul can still exile them from the graveyard and return them to the battlefield as an enchantment token. So if we manifested an opponent's Rhystic Study and then sacrificed that manifest creature, we'd exile the Rhystic Study from the graveyard and then get a token copy of it. Myrkul doesn't care about what the creatures were as they left the battlefield, it cares what they are once they're in the graveyard and ready to be exiled with the effect. And that is really slick. I asked judge chats and they confirmed that Myrkul won't make anything for any manifested instants and sorceries, so be aware of that. But yeah, manifest is tricky cool value. So Thieving Amalgam, you sneaky devil, get on in here and join the party. And that's it. That's my swap. Consider your average upped. A link to this version of the deck is in the description below, but now let's get to the good stuff. Let's make this deck more budget friendly. Remember, Smothering Tithe is just a card name. It's not a way of life to play EDH decks. We don't have to break the bank here. A budget list for Myrkul is still very Myrkul. It's the worst joke I've ever written, but you know what? We're gonna keep it. Let's move on. A decent chunk of the budget is made up from just the lands. When we cut out any lands over $5, which is about a dozen cards, we save like $160. A full fourth of the cost saved by just cutting out some parts of the mana base. Before we make budget cuts to the rest of the deck, let's go ahead and get the mana base situation sorted out. First up, budget duels are budget duels. I like dual typing because we have a lot of land searching in here that cares about specific land types. Speaking of which, actually, Crows and Verge, love your friend, let's get you into this deck as well. We don't have access to the Triome if we're building this deck on a budget, but we do have Murmuring Bosk, so we're still set to help find all of our colors with the specific ramp effects that we're using. I quibbled earlier about Sandstep Citadel and Path of Ancestry, but whichever one the previous deck was running, we'll make sure that they both are present in this version. Admittedly, this is a decent chunk of lands that enter the battlefield tapped, which I was a little reticent about in Section 1 since I like the deck's original tempo, but I think generally a budget version of this deck will acknowledge the cost on tempo and be able to handle it pretty well. It's better for us to get our colors in order. After all, we've got a pretty big game plan that we have to set up. Alright, let's continue. We no longer have the expensive fetches, but Terramorphic, Evolving Wilds, and Ash Barrens are decent mana fixing. This deck already includes a Caves of Koilos, so I'll include Llanowar Wastes too. I'd add in a Brushland, but it's still like $10 or something because it hasn't been reprinted in ages. Fingers crossed for that sometime soon, hint hint, Wizards of the Coast. But anyway, we'll round this out by filling the rest with a few extra basic lands, and boom! A solid mana base that does not break the bank, and which will help us get our colors in order. There's a slight change to the tempo of the deck, but it's not a massive decrease. It's not like we went from 60 miles an hour to 30 miles an hour. It's more like we went from 60 to 50. Still a perfectly sensible speed. Alright, now to the big non-land cuts. There are a lot of very famous spells in this here average Myrkul deck. Teferi's Protection, Doubling Season, huge creatures, awesome role fillers, the whole shebang. As always though, we're fine without them. These cards grease the wheels of the deck, for sure, but they are not the core of the deck. We'll be able to find nice replacements without sweating too much. We'll lose another 16 cards here that each cost over $5, but this will save us more than $350 on the list. So, that was a big budget culling, but again, look what's left over. Look at these creatures. Look how strong the actual strategy of this deck still is. It is, of course, always so perfectly fine to play a deck on whatever budget is most appropriate to you. When commanders have effects that are this spicy, we don't need the big budget cards to do all the work for us. We've got a lot of synergies that we can still unlock. So what do we replace them with? Well, our job here is to try and replace any effects that we feel we might now be lacking. For instance, we lost some big mana cards like Smothering Tithe or even Birds of Paradise, so I'll opt to replace them with a Feyburrow Elder and a Wild Growth. Feyburrow is a great mana dork for this deck, and Wild Growth fits right into the enchantment constellation stuff that we're already up to. We also lost a couple of card advantage effects, namely cards like Sylvan Library, and in my opinion, it's appropriate to overcorrect for the loss of card advantage. In the budget culling, we lost a lot of spells that draw us cards, protect our stuff, or provide redundancy. And the number one thing that will help out with every single one of those losses is to add in more card advantage to help us better find the protection and redundancy that we still have in the deck. So, Harmonize, Painful Truths, I know you're a little expected, but you're also very, very good. They are classics and deservedly so. And to be a little on theme with our draw effects too, I'd also love a Plumb the Forbidden in this deck. It's a simple draw effect that can also act as a mass sacrifice outlet if we happen to need it. Welcome to the deck, friends. I'll add one more too. Midnight Reaper, say hi. I can't help but notice that you'll draw us a lot of cards when all our little creatures die and become enchantments. In fact, I can't help but notice that you will become an enchantment that keeps drawing more cards for us over the course of the game. You'll love to see it. Next, I think it's best for us to tackle our interaction section. We lost some heavy hitters in the budget culling, and Abzan is full to the brim with excellent removal. Generous Gift can join the Beast Within that's already in the deck, and I am absolutely in love with the new card Tear Asunder. What a masterpiece this card is. And to join it, I'll do one more, a card that really does some double duty here, Foundation Breaker. With Myrkul in play, any evoked creature will enter, KO something, then leave, and then come right back as an enchantment and knock something else out too. That's great utility. And I think there's room for two more here that will be pretty important for us, Vanquish the Horde and Tamiyo's Safekeeping. Since we're on a slightly different tempo now, I think it behooves us to have at least one more board wipe in the deck, and Vanquish the Horde is one of the very best, though of course any board wipe will do. Tamiyo Safekeeping, meanwhile, is a little one-off common that puts in just a ton of work, and it helps us keep Myrkul safe, which is extremely important for the deck to work. With a little more interaction and removal in the budget version of the list, we can adapt to the deck's different tempo, helping us not only to survive, but also to thrive. And thus, our next additions are, well, actually, they're the opposite of surviving, I guess. We lost some powerful sacrifice outlets during the budget cuts, so let's get some replacements in here. Longtime viewers of the Upping the Average series won't be shocked to see me recommend Spawning Pit and Fanatical Devotion. They are just so dang good. Myrkul mostly loves to have sacrifice outlets in the form of creatures, since those creatures will then become enchantments, but we do need some redundancy in case we don't manage to find any of those, and these will kickstart all of our aristocrats to supercharge our endgame. And naturally, that brings us to our final three inclusions, which have to fill the role that big cards like Beledros filled in the original Average deck. Basically, I'd like very much to make sure that we have the ability to produce enough extra bodies that will keep our death trigger effects well fed. So, the first card I'm adding is the classic Sir Conrad. A powerhouse, a menace, we all know and love him, or we all know and hate him. One more aristocrat to help flesh out our endgame. And the final 2 slots, I'd like to fill with some weird token makers, our old friend Scoot Swarm and Mitotic Slime. I've rhapsodized before about how much work Mitotic Slime put in my Marin deck. This card is 7 bodies for 5 mana, and that is no joke. And if we happen to be able to pick it off even when it's an enchantment, we can do some of that all over again. And as for Scoot Swarm, this one's especially wicked. We've all seen Scoot Swarms pop off, but there's another reason I like it here. If it's a creature, it will make copies of itself that take over the board and give us tons of sacrifice fodder. But if it's an enchantment, whenever it tries to make copies of itself, it'll make more enchantment tokens, which means our constellation cards will go berserk. Either way, this card will absolutely overwhelm our enemies. Okay, those are the official swaps, but before we wrap up, I'll mention one final thing. A quick honorable mention for the higher budget players or for folks who wish to take this deck in a different direction. I mentioned Cinderhaze Wretch earlier, which totally demolishes other people's hands, and I think it's fair to say that not every player loves that. A general vibe around most tables that I notice is that people want their opponents to still be able to do the thing, but they just want their own deck to do the thing better. But, some playgroups enjoy that cutthroat style, and if that's the case, Myrkul is also quite the candidate for a hate bear strategy that turns all of those little pesky creatures into little pesky enchantments that are nearly impossible for enemies to get out from underneath. And, of course, Myrkul can also go all in on combo strats too. For example, once you've used a Devoted Druid to get infinite mana, a Walking Ballista or some other mana sink will win the game in pretty short fashion. Though the hate bears and the combo strategies weren't explicitly represented in the average data, it's good to know what this commander is capable of and what its reputation might be, so that you can find the experience that you and your playgroup wish to enjoy. Alright, that'll do it. Here we have a budget Myrkul list, all set and ready to grind our enemies to dust. You can find a link to both versions of the deck in the description below, with the cuts in the maybe board. The Lord of Bones appreciates your worship, and if you have any other recommendations that you'd like to make for your fellow Myrkul players, make sure you leave your suggestions down in the comments below. And thanks so much for watching.